When we put too much detail in the background of our scene, we are competing for attention with the rest of our painting. Today I'm going to show you how minimizing and simplifying and softening that background in your painting can bring a level of focus and clarity to your scenes that can really help you take that next step forward as a painter. I want to show that the mountains are in the background, but I don't want the mountains to take over the painting. So as I always do, I'm wetting down the front of my paper and the back of my paper. And this is key when it comes to painting the background as well, because if we have a nice damp piece of paper that we're working from, we can get those lost, soft, wet into wet edges that really create the depth in your scene that you're looking for. So the first thing I'm doing is wetting down my paper after I've laid in my drawing. And I like to start with the light areas first. And so the light tone of the mountain, I want to dull that down. And I'm using a little bit of raw sienna, a little bit of lavender for that. And we're working nice and wet into wet. And you can see right here from the mountain, there's a difference between the tone or the color temperature of the background and the warmer color temperature of the stone. And so I'm warming this up a little bit. It's a subtle change, more raw sienna for the stone of this chimney and cooler gray color for the mountain in the background. So that is part of how we can bring the middle ground forward, and the foreground forward is by using more saturation in those areas of the painting and painting your background in more of a dull, softer, less saturated way. Watercolor timing in this scene is important because I've dampened the paper and I've laid in the first light tones for the mountain. Now I want to go in with some richer pigment for the blue of the sky and really push that blue around that mountain. But I'm doing this while the paper is still damp, so I have to be mindful of how much water is on my brush. And I'm using this larger synthetic Escoda brush that will hold a decent amount of paint, but it's not like a natural hair brush where it's just fully like loaded and sopping wet, where it's going to drop a whole bunch of water and pigment into the scene. So by using this brush and having a little more control, I can paint around the mountain while it's still damp, but still leave a little bit of form to it so that blue just isn't flooding down into the mountain. And there was a little bit of white at the top of the chimney here, the large pipe that's sticking up here in the scene. And so I just was able to paint around that. Even though I dampened the whole paper, by the time I got to that, it was dry enough that I could still paint around it and leave a little white gap of the paper. And so I'm moving into the lighter value on the roof of this building, and that is some Cobalt Teal Blue and some raw sienna. Always looking at the light values, especially in the first wash of the painting. That's really what I'm focusing on here. And I'm okay with letting the colors kind of flow into each other. And here's another example of the paper kind of drying up. It's still damp where I've painted on it, but this area here, I can still paint around the fence posts and come back to those when I change my pigment and get to the right value. And one thing I wanted to do was drop in some lighter color for this stone while the paper is still damp. I want those soft little changes in color to just fuzz in this chimney shape here where the stone is. And a little bit of light color for the top of that chimney. And you'll notice I'm working with a paper towel in my hand. If there's little bits that I want to bring the light back out, say they got a little bit too dark, I can push down with that paper towel and just lift off a little bit of color. And that's what I'm doing here. I wanted some of those stones to be lighter in color, and I can use this paper towel and just lift off a few little areas where I want to focus the light in a little bit more. Some lighter color for the wood, that old wood that makes up the fence. And I'm coming in with the warmer color for the path, the little road that's leading into the town here. As I get down to the foreground, I'm increasing my value and my strength of paint. So you'll notice how light it is up here. And as I work my way down, I'm getting darker and darker and darker. That is helping to push the light into the scene. And you'll see when we get into the next phase of the painting, where I'm painting the middle values, having that light back there shows me where to focus into the middle ground of the scene. And the paper's still damp. Now I'm dropping in some value for the grass. There's a little bit of grass around the dirt road here, And I'm taking a smaller synthetic brush and I'm using some raw sienna, some cobalt turquoise to drop some of this nice green onto the paper while it's still damp. So you can see I'm getting these nice kind of soft lost edges. And all of this is going to pay off when we get into the next phase of the painting. So we have to remember that we're painting in phases. The first phase is all the light values. The second phase, the large middle value connected shape, and the last phase of the painting is the darks and the details, and that's where we bring the whole scene together. Now, while this is damp, I wanted to drop in a few of the little differences that we're seeing on the ground in the value of the dirt. And this is a little dirt road. There's some stones. It's uneven. There's some shadow. I'm taking this time to really work back into the paper, into the wet and wet, and paint wet into wet, to drop in some of these subtle little color changes right now while the paper is damp. And there we are. That is what the first wash of the painting looks like. At this stage, I let my painting dry, and then we come back into the next phase. Okay, at this point, the paper is nice and dry. And what I do before I go into painting the middle value connected shape is I want to dampen the mountain a little bit again, because I want to really push that background back. I want to soften it, and I don't want to get too obsessed with all the little trees, all the little detail that's on the mountain back there. So I've taken a damp brush and I've gone over this area up until this point. So I've dampened this area, and then when we get to the stone, that's when I want a little more of a hard edge. And now I'm mixing up some cobalt turquoise and raw sienna. The trick with the background is you don't want to go too saturated. If you can dull down your colors a little bit for the background. If you're using green, you're not using your most vibrant green. You're saving that vibrant green for the middle ground where you want the most attention to be. And another thing that's helpful is to squint at your reference photo to really try to minimize how you see and how you paint the background. I think a good comparison is thinking about digital photography. When digital cameras first came out, they didn't have a lot of depth. Their lenses were more thin. It wasn't until later when some of the other cameras came out with better lenses that you really started to see some depth in photography. Same thing on the iPhone or smartphones. When they first came out, obviously the cameras weren't as good quality. And as they've developed and continued to improve, the quality of the camera is better. And there's even simulated depth of field. That's where the background will blur out digitally after the photo is taken. When the background is completely crisp and completely in focus, and we're seeing every tree on the mountain, well, then that background is starting to compete with the middle ground and the foreground. So just like cameras advanced and people really wanted that depth of field in their photography, you can bring that same approach to painting. So as I get up to the edge of this chimney, there is a little bit of a hard edge there, but I still want to see what values from the background are similar enough that I can connect. So that's where squinting comes into play. Squint at your scene. Are there some similar values? What connections and value can I find between the background and the middle ground? And what that helps us do is create a more cohesive painting. Every level of the painting should interlock with the other levels. And by finding that large connected shape of the scene and finding the connection between the middle ground and the foreground and the background, you can have a more cohesive and a stronger painting. As I work down the abstract mountain in the background, I increase the value as I get closer to where these buildings are. And that happens if you look at a scene. As the trees and hills are closer to your subject, they are stronger in value and they will have more saturation in their colors as well. And I painted around this little pole here. I knew I wanted a vertical, and again, that's a nice way to connect the middle ground of the scene with the background of the scene too. That interlocking shape is so important. And you can see I've mixed in some lavender and I've cooled down this green a little bit as I get close to here. And I'll increase that saturation and the value as I get into the middle ground. So you can see I painted up to where this edge was, and then that's a good place to pause. That's a smaller connection. And I'll find the connection in value when I come back to that area. So right now, that mountain is sitting nicely in the background. And as I get into these other buildings, I'm finding ways to connect them into the background, and I'm also increasing the value. I'm increasing the strength of my paint. That's going to help that middle ground feel closer to us. I'm dragging some of the texture for the roof of these buildings from the background, connecting it right into these buildings in the middle ground. The shadow side of these buildings is connecting right into the mountain in the background. I really liked how the top of this chimney or pipe or smokestack, whatever you call this thing here, I laid in the light value in the first wash. Now I'm going over it with stronger values where it's darker, but I wanted to show the form of it. So here I'm coming in with a damp brush and just softening what I painted, and it ends with this nice little rounded feel. From this wet edge, I've started to drag some texture over onto the stone. So that's how I'm able to connect the background with what's going on here in the middle ground. And there's some little lines and texture on this roof I pulled down. All right, now I'm gonna move over here. I'm gonna connect the shadow here onto the shadow side of this. And here I'm using a mixture of burnt sienna, some raw sienna, and some neutral tint. And I'm looking at the reference photo and finding connections within this shape. Just taking my time here. And when you always come back and work from a wet edge, you can take your time because things are not drying so fast. And here is the shadow on the side of this chimney. And this is all still damp and connected the shadow side of this all the way back up into that mountain. So we have some nice connectivity and cohesiveness from the background into the middle ground. And texture is a big key in creating depth as well. The sharpness and crisp lines here in the middle ground are pulling that area forward, and the softness and looseness of that mountain in the background are letting that just sit right in the background. And that right there, that difference is what all this is about, and that will help you create depth in your paintings. And there's some value on the side of the fence posts here and the shadow on the ground. I want to connect all that into this shadow shape. And there were some little lines and texture on the wood of this wall. I'm dragging some of those lines down while this is still damp. And now I'm using some thicker pigment, and I'm coming to the bottom of this shadow, this cast shadow on the ground, and just dragging it out. I'm looking at my reference photo at the terrain and how the shadow's getting cast on uneven ground. And I want to show that in how I paint this. So I'm not using a lot of straight, real defined lines. I'm letting the shadow show the terrain of the dirt road here. And coming off the side of that wooden walkway, the shadow will really define that. And I've worked back into the shadows of this building and connected that. And now I'm connecting this shadow into the shadows cast down from the fence posts. Trying to make this as loose and impressionistic as I can. Not a lot of real straight lines. Always looking for connections. Pulling this around. I also wanted a variety of edges. So the shadow here was more defined. It was being cast by a building that was right next to us, that was just out of frame. Over here were some softer shadows that were being cast by trees that were further away. So those shadows are a little more soft and less defined. And I wet down this little area with, I can't remember if I used a spray bottle or a damp brush, but either way, I dampened the paper here so I could have these nice, loose, nondescript, non-defined lines on this part of the shadow. And this is what it looks like when we have the middle value shape in place. And let's talk really quickly about how we treated the background. So my first wash was dry, dampened the paper down here for the mountains, and then I worked into that. I was increasing value and the amount of paint that I'm using as I got towards the bottom of the mountains, and then connecting the value of the mountains and the shape of the mountains into the shape of the shadow side of the buildings, looking for connections between the chimney and the background mountain, and connecting into this big connected shadow. So that's what we did in the middle value shape. Now we're going to paint the darks and the details of the scene. I'm going to start in the background here, and now all this is dry at this point, and I need a few little marks to suggest the detail of these buildings in the distance, a little more texture till I feel like that's enough detail, some little defining marks and bits. I knew I needed some more darks on these buildings that were in the middle ground, so I'm looking at the reference photo, trying to see where those little bits of dark and separation are. Little windows, things like that. Windows on the face of that building. Right away, this starts to lock into focus, the middle ground of this painting. In comparison, the background of the painting starts to feel more like the distance. All because we're focusing our attention here in the middle ground, and we've chosen to minimize what's happening in the background. A little bit of texture and marks, and some of this is just tweaking, adding some texture. Again, really thinking about the hierarchy of the scene, what's important, where do I want people to look, all while trying to not overwork too much. That's always the trick, always the balance that we're trying to find. And what I'm doing here is using a little bit of dry brush to bring this area forward, give it a little bit more detail. Oh, I put a little fence post here. I wanted to have something here in this part of the scene that was connecting into the background, and I thought this little fence post with some dark painted around the top of it would be a nice little connector. Some birds in the scene would be really nice. Something down here, something right here in this area to cast a little bit stronger of a shadow and something. So I decided to add some birds into the scene. And I was just Googling, pictures of birds, trying to get some real loose bits of form. Bird there. And then I decided I'll put a few little birds flying in the sky there. And one of the last things I did was I added a little bit of warmth and saturation, a little bit of wash over this wall here. I felt like it needed a little more color, and that would really help pull that area forward. So I'm using some raw sienna, some burnt sienna to do a little wash over this, and by leaving some little bits behind, I'm really increasing the information within the light area of this painting and adding more texture and interest in this area and really helping to pull that area forward. And here is a look at the final painting. The next time you are painting a scene, think about ways that you can minimize the background and saving the most contrast, the most saturation, the most texture right in that middle ground and foreground, and see if that doesn't help you create a greater sense of depth in your painting. Have you ever been really excited about a painting and you get all set up, you find that right reference that you're excited about, and then it's time to go and you feel lost? I have a free resource that I want to give to you today that can help with these problems. My 5 steps to plan a successful watercolor painting. I walk you through the crucial planning phase of your painting that will help you understand what you're going to paint first, second, and third. The planning is really so important, especially in watercolor. This medium is harder to correct. It's so immediate. So having that plan is very important. I send you a PDF that you can download. And the great thing about this is you can have it on your phone, you could print it out, and you can take a look at these crucial planning steps before you start each painting. All you have to do is follow this link here and download my 5-step guide to planning a successful watercolor painting.